Hello everyone and welcome to another game from the penultimate round of the Norway Chess 2022. It's Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and again we will have another clash between the two of them in the Gruenfeld defense, which is always a pleasure. Maxime being the greatest Gruenfeld expert in the world, and he always plays very enjoyable games, and Magnus just a very strong player altogether. So let's dive straight into it, as there is quite a lot to enjoy. You will have one very difficult pause the video moment, but I think it's also going to be a nice one for you. Magnus has the white pieces and he opens with d4, which pretty much against Maxime knows that we will have a Gruenfeld. So knight to f6, c4, g6, knight to c3, and d5. The Gruenfeld defense is on the board. We have c captures, knight captures, and e4 going for the center grab. The exchange variation is here. Knight captures, b captures, and bishop to g7. And now again, there are many possible ways to continue the game for white. We always mention this: knight to f3, bishop to c4, basically the most popular, then knight f3, bishop to e3. But Magnus plays bishop to b5 with check. He says, all right, let's play the fourth most popular continuation, just to see if you really know your stuff. So here c6, blocking check with bishop to a4, and now b5. Maxime says thank you for this free queenside expansion. Bishop to b3, and now pawn all the way to a5. We have knight to f3 by Magnus, and both players castles. So castles, and now there are a couple of games that reach this position. For example, in the game Nakamura versus Yanni Pomnishi in the Grandchester Blitz in Paris, c5 was played, and their game ended in a draw. But here we have a4 by Maxime, and a4 is indeed the engine stop recommendation. So Maxime obviously knows about that game, and he knows his Gruenfeld, and it is now, as of move 11, that we have a completely new game. So Magnus brings the bishop back, bishop to c2, and now challenging the center with c5. Makes sense, the rook is still on a1, so we want to strike at the center as soon as possible. So rook to b1 by Magnus, and now bishop to g4. And now, okay, the pawn is attacked, but when has Maxime ever defended a pawn? And you can't really just go pawn grabbing here. If you play rook captures on b5, then c captures on d4. The knight is not really defending there, and if captures, knight to c6, we just add another attacker, and you're now already playing Maxime's game. It's not really not a fun thing to do. If you advance the pawn, then knight d4, the knight now cannot really be defended well, so you have to play something else, and it's just not all that great. Rook d5, for example, attacks the queen, queen b6, and so on. But most likely you are playing exactly what Maxime wants you to play. So Magnus plays e5. This limits the power of the dark square bishop here, and knight to c6. We just continue striking against the center. We have bishop to e4 now attacking the knight, and the knight also can't move. So rook to c8. On pinning and defending with h3, and here Maxime gives up the light square bishop, captures, and queen d7, adding another defender to the knight here, also connecting the rooks with bishop to d3, and now comes c captures on d4. Sorry about that, I think Meadow wants to come in. Yep, that was him. C captures on d4, and now grabbing finally the b5 pawn. Bishop captures on b5, putting pressure on the knight here. D captures on c3, and now queen captures on c3. So yes, you are putting the queen in front of the rook, but if the knight moves, also bishop captures on d7 is there. So queen to d5, going after the a2 pawn, and we have a trade. Bishop captures, queen captures, and now rook to a1, attacking the queen. And here Maxime plays a most interesting move. He could move the queen, of course, queen to e6, for example. That's a nice move, but he actually plays knight captures on e5, and he offers his queen for Magnus's queen, but you know, at the end of the day, he just grabbed a pawn. So he will be up a pawn. And the thing is, sorry, there are a couple of ways you could treat this. You could just trade on the spot with queen captures on c8, which is possible. Let's say queen captures on a1. We're going to play queen back to c2. And now let's say rook to a8. Going after the bishop, we defend the bishop. And now e6. And the game continues, Maxime being up a pawn. So this is one possibility. But Magnus goes for the other one. After knight captures on e5, he just trades. Rook captures on a2. Maxime grabs the queen on c3. And bishop to d2. And okay, Maxime is up a pawn. Magnus has the bishop pair. So you should not be able to push this all the way. But it's, it's still a game. And it's a classical one. So rook back to c8. And now bishop to b5. Remaneuvering the bishop over to e2. Rook to c5 attacks the bishop, bishop back to e2, and now knight to c6. We have rook to c1, offering a rook trade, and now rook captures. We have bishop captures, and now rook to b8. Finally developing that rook, bishop to e3, and now bishop to d4, offering a trade of bishops as well. But as Magnus is down a pawn, he's not interested in giving up the bishop pair. So bishop h6, bishop g7, bishop back to e3, checking if Maxime will repeat. But Maxime doesn't repeat. Maxime wants to play. He plays h5, g3. We have pawn to e6, and now king to g2 by Magnus, and now knight to b4, remaneuvering the knight to d5 to put pressure on the e3 square or the bishop. So rook to d2, we have knight to d5, and here Magnus doesn't move the bishop. Let's say you go bishop g5, then we further attack it with f6 and so on. He just plays rook to d3, and now he gives up the bishop pair. He says, all right, you can have it, but you're still not winning this. So knight captures, rook captures, and bishop to d4 now. Harassing the rook, rook to d3, now pawn to e5. We have rook to d2 and king to g7. Pawn to h4, and now king to h6. We have f4. Now, of course, you can't capture it because the bishop would hang. Bishop to e3, and now rook to d7, going after the f7 pawn. But here, Maxime just plays e captures on f4. And capturing on f7 would be a deadly mistake here, because if you capture here, rook to b2. Beautiful winning idea. We just attack the bishop. There's no really a good way to defend it. If king f3, we just play f captures on g3. We even give up a piece here. So king captures on e3, now g2. How are you stopping the passed pawn? If king f2, just rook captures here. There's no capturing the g2 pawn. If king g1, we just move the rook, we give up the pawn, and once we capture this pawn, we're up 2 pawns. Of course, this is now completely winning for Maxime. So instead of this, after e captures on f4, we have g captures on f4, and now pawn to f5 by Maxime, king to f3, and here we have bishop back to c1. Interestingly, if you threaten some nasty discoveries, let's say you try something like rook to b3, Magnus can always go for this bishop to g8 idea and try to deliver checkmate here. You're not going to be able to do it, but it's still a fun attempt. Let's say rook b4, bishop to g8. Now we play rook captures on f4 with check. Give up the bishop on e3, and now rook captures here. But okay, first we deliver a check, and here let's say we go capture on h4. Now the king has the g5 square. He has the three pawns for the bishop, and it's well, it's a draw. But if anything, black should be better. So okay, instead, after king f3, we have bishop back to c1 by Maxime, bishop to c4. Magnus now going for this very nice idea if the rook ever moves from the back rank. Rook to c8 attacks the bishop, and now bishop to f7. Now you also have to be careful so you don't blunder the g6 pawn. Rook to c3 with check. We have king to g2, and now bishop captures on f4. And here, what can Magnus play? Well, Magnus plays bishop to g8. He is now down 2 pawns, and he has to do something about this. So he plays bishop to g8, goes after this checkmate. Now pawn to g5 by Maxime. And here Magnus plays not h captures. If h captures, king captures. This is an active king to pass pawns. Of course, black will win this. Magnus instead plays bishop to e6. He goes after this pawn. And here, well, it's a very tricky position, but it's a completely winning one for Maxime. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find the move that wins the game for Maxime while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations, but also this was a warm-up because the second pause the video moment will be even tougher. and for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is G captures on H4. This is not what Maxime played. He missed this one. Point is that now if bishop captures on F5, we have H3 with check. That's the whole point. And now what do you play? There's really no good move you can play. If you play bishop captures on H3, then rook to G3 with check, and now you can't keep defending the bishop. If you go king H2, you go under the mask of the bishop, then we just play rook to G7, open up a discovery, and pick up the rook on D7. Not a lot of fun. For example, king to H3. Okay, yeah, you can't really play that because the bishop defends the rook, but you can play something like rook to D3 with check, and after king to G2, we're gonna play rook to G3 again, and after king to H2, now we're gonna play this bishop to B8 move. That's the way to do it. And now there's no good move for white, because you can't move the king, you can't really move the bishop anywhere. Because if you move the bishop, let's say to F5, we just win the bishop. We make a discovery, pick it up. So you have to move the rook, and once the rook moves anywhere from the light D7 square, then we can win it. For example, if rook D8, now rook G8 check, and we pick up the rook. So it's a really tricky line, and of course definitely an easy one to miss. So you're not going to be able to play bishop captures on H3. You're going to have to play something, let's say king F2. Now comes H2. And now after rook to D1, preventing this pawn from being queened, you're going to play rook to G3. And now this is the point, rook H1, and now you are going to play rook to G1, and there is no way to save this, because if rook captures, we just play bishop to E3 check, and only after the king captures we're gonna pick up the rook. So here you would have this position, and you're not going to be able to capture. You're going to have to play something like bishop to E4, but now we just play H4, H3, bring the king into the game, and slowly but surely you will win this, because white is without any move. So it's incredibly complicated, and not all that difficult to imagine that you would miss that this is winning. Because if you can't calculate the exact perfect line, you will not play this. So instead, king to G6 by Maxime, but now Magnus just plays rook D5. Now he will win the F5 pawn. G4, we have bishop captures on F5, king F6, and bishop to H7 now, going after the H5 pawn, and now bishop to E5, blocking the attack this way, bishop to G6, now offering a trade of bishops, and here, if you really wanted, you could just capture this, and it's a draw, but Maxime doesn't want to do this, and it's actually a beautiful draw. If king captures, rook captures here, and you play rook to H3, you say, okay, I'm going to win this pawn, I'm going to be up 2 pawns, how is this a draw? It's actually a very simple draw. Let's say rook A5 or something, a rook captures on H4. Now, how do you, okay, let's say rook A6 check, how do you make progress here? The only way to prevent the rook from checking you is to go all the way, zigzag your way through checks, and try and force the rook somewhere else. But even if that happens, let's say king F5, you deliver a check, king here, check, king here, check, king here. Now you will not play rook to A4 with check, but rather you will play rook to A3. And that's the whole point. Now you don't have this rook to H3 move, and you don't have any other moves with the rook. You don't have a pawn move, so you can just move your king, but that will not help you. For example, you can attack the rook here, but we're just going to play rook to G3. And you can't further advance the king. You can go with the king all the way to here, but then we're just going to move the rook. And you can never bring your rook into the game, and you cannot do anything here, even though you're up 2 pawns. So it's a very classy move by Magnus, this bishop to G6 idea, trying to get a draw here. But Maxime sees right through it. He plays G3. We have rook to A3. We have rook to A5, and now comes a rook to C4, putting pressure on the pawn here. Rook to A6 with check, king to G7, and finally bishop captures on G5. We have rook captures on H4. Now Maxime does have a protected pass pawn, but it's very hard to push this with the black king being so inactive. Rook to G6 with check, king H7, and now rook to G5, attacking the bishop. Rook H2 check, king to f3. Here, king to g1 and king to f1 are the only possible moves that don't lose the game for white. After king to f3, Magnus's position is again lost, but it's again incredibly hard to see it. Rook f2 check was played, king g4, bishop to f4 attacking the rook, and the rook to g6. And now again we have this incredibly complicated position where there is a winning idea, but it's just yeah, okay. Feel free to pause the video and try to spot this one while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting this, positional brilliancy. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is bishop to c7. Interestingly, you could also play bishop to e5, your position is still winning. You could also play bishop to b8, your position will still be winning. But it's basically a matter of just wasting moves until you finally play bishop to c7, because you will need the d8 square to actually win this. But the real idea is that we want to take away the f5 square from the white king. That's the whole point. We want to force the white king either on h4 or on h3. The point is, and you will see why, because Maxime missed this idea, but after bishop to c7, how do you play this? Of course, if you go, if you move the king somewhere, because now the f-file is off limits, we just play rook to h2 with check. And once king g4 is played, rook to h1, and now we are covering the g1 square. So now g2, g1, this is unstoppable. Doesn't really matter what you play. You could play anything. Let's say you play king to f3, we just play rook captures on h5. So you have to keep defending the bishop. If you play king to g5, we simply play bishop to d8 with check. That's why the bishop on c7 was crucial. And after king g4, just g2. You can't prevent a rook to g1. It's just unstoppable. So another thing, after bishop to c7, okay, you don't have to play king to h4. You could play rook to g5, just try and waste the move. Doesn't really matter. Now we play rook to f1, and again we control the queening square. And after, let's say, rook g6, you try to waste the move, g2. Now comes king h3, and of course g1 queen, we pick up the queen, and we have a completely winning endgame. So that's why here moving the bishop was winning bishop to c7, the actual winning move. But Maxime played rook to f1. It seems like it's the same, and we want to go into that line, but he now gives Magnus one move that he wouldn't have in that line, and that is king to f5. The only move that saves the game for Magnus. He of course spots it, and he hides the king on f5. There are no good discoveries. All of white's pieces are on light squares. So bishop to g5 check was played here, trying one last trick. Of course, if Magnus captures, then g2 is winning now. You can't just move the king, because if king h4, rook to h1, and you force the king back to the g file. King g3, g1 check, you have a queen, white doesn't, of course, completely winning. So king e4 was played, now comes rook to f4 and king to d3. We have rook to f5, and now king to e4. Again, not allowing Maxime to start pushing his pawn, because we would just gobble up the rook, and after this queen comes into the game, we gobble up the bishop as well, and the queen will not be able to win against the rook and bishop. So instead, we have rook to f4 with check, king d3, and now bishop to h4. Rook to e6, and now finally pawn to g2. We have rook to g6, now guarding the queening square, rook to f5, attacking the bishop, and here you don't really have an option of saving the bishop, because here Maxime is preparing rook to g5, and then he will just queen his pawn, so you have to give up the bishop. Rook captures on g2, and now rook captures on h5, and of course this is a known draw. Both Magnus and MVL are more than able to draw this easily, especially in a classical game, but of course it's polite to try and see if your opponent is in a good mood. He might blunder the game. So bishop to f6, we have king to f4, bishop to g7, and now king to e4. You just wait for black to try and force something. King to g8, he has to bring the king into the game. Rook to g6, we have king to f7, now comes rook to a6, cutting off the black king from going after the white king. Bishop to f6, now comes rook to a8, rook to h4 check, king to f5, rook to h5 check, king to e4. Magnus shows that he knows his stuff. Rook to b5, now comes king to f4. We have bishop to e5 check, king to e4, bishop to d6, and now rook to h8. And it was in this position on move 79 that Magnus and Maxime agreed to a draw, as there is nothing more to be done here. So really an incredible game. They've played many games, especially in this Gruenfeld defense that is so enjoyable to watch. Magnus defeated him many times, and now Maxime finally had his chance. He had two great winning ideas, but as you've seen, both of them are incredibly complicated, and unfortunately for Maxime, he misses both of them. But they are going into Armageddon, and we are going to see what happened there, most likely in the next video, but also maybe not. We'll see how it goes. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We're gonna cover a few more games before we check out the standings, as a lot has happened. I would like to thank Charles Huff, Nagarjuna Ponugoti, Timo Salo, Adrian Martin Nagorski, and Benjamin Bogwald for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this wonderful event until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.